The armory smelled like cold oil and metal left too long in winter air. The team lined up for standard issue rifles, signing receipts with stiff fingers while a storm rolled in beyond the hangar doors. When her turn came, she looked at the weapon, paused, and slid the clipboard back without taking it. No explanation, just a quiet refusal that made a few men smirk. The officer in charge warned her once. She didn't argue. She opened her kit instead and checked a different system, older, personally maintained, zeroed for cold, tuned to her hands. Hours later, when the issued rifles began to fail in freezing wind, the team understood what she had protected them from. The staging base sat in a white basin between dark ridges, a temporary knot of shelters and antennas hammered into frozen ground. Fuel trucks idled with their vents coughing thin vapor. The wind came down the valley with a steady drag, scraping tents and making the floodlights sway. Everyone moved fast, because cold punished hesitation. A clock over the armory door showed the next flight window, and the numbers looked too close. Inside, the armorer worked through a stack of identical cases. He did not look up much, only called names, and shoved a weapon across the counter. Each rifle came with the same sight, the same magazine allotment, the same sling, the same clipped-on light. The chain of custody mattered more than fit. The deployment order had been cut short, and speed was now the logic. Sergeant Miles Harper signed, hefted his rifle and moved on. Staff Sergeant Logan Pierce followed, checking the serial number with a glance he didn't linger on. Corporal Ben Carter took his and cracked the bolt once, just to feel it. Specialist Ian Foster murmured something about luck and cold, then tucked his gear into his case. The line inched forward. Lieutenant Ryan Caldwell stood by the armorer watching. He said nothing about customizations and nothing about preferences. He knew the supply list, the timeline, and what weather could do to metal. He needed his people out the door in minutes, not debating gear. When it was her turn, Sergeant Elena Ward stepped up and saw the rifle on the counter. She stared at it as though it were a tool she had never seen. Her hands remained at her sides. The armorer waited. The line waited. She slid the clipboard back across the counter, without taking the pen. Caldwell looked at her, then at the rifle, then back. He spoke once, an even tone made sharp by the room's thin air. He warned her about the requirement, about chain of custody and standard issue, about the weight of rules in a place where rules kept people alive. She nodded. No argument, no attitude. She opened her kit instead, knelt, and drew a weapon wrapped in a padded sleeve. It was not new, but it was clean. She wiped the receiver with a cloth and checked the bolt with a tight, familiar motion. Harper's mouth twitched. Carter's smirk arrived in the same moment. It was not a loud reaction, just a small fracture in the line's discipline. The armorer frowned as if he had seen every kind of stubbornness, and knew which ones were worth the time to confront. Caldwell watched her hands and held his reply. He knew her performance record, her prior deployments, her cold weather course, and how she kept her gear. He also knew the risk of letting a refusal stand. She placed her rifle on the counter, letting him see the paperwork tucked under the case straps. Approved kit, serial logged, certification up to date. She had done the bureaucratic work long before the storm rolled in. The armorer tapped the document, then looked at Caldwell. A short nod passed between them. The standard issue rifle stayed on the counter. Outside the armory door, the wind rose and the light dipped. The team began loading. The refusal was already labeled in their minds as a statement. Most men in the line saw her as careful to the point of friction, a professional who valued her own gear over shared procedure. It was an opinion they would not voice in front of her, but it followed her into the staging area, into the trucks, into the silence that came before the flight. In the hangar, the noise of the turbine test stand blurred with the wind. The team sat on ammo crates in a semicircle, uniforms layered with cold weather shells. Jokes broke the tension because tension had to be managed. It was how people carried fear without naming it. Carter kept his voice low, but aimed it where everyone could hear. He said something about special snowflakes and personal toys. Foster chuckled and checked his battery pack. Pierce did not join in, but his face said he saw the point. Harper watched Elena Ward the way a senior non-commissioned officer watches someone who might pull the room off center. Harper had come up in units where personal gear was tolerated, only when it didn't complicate shared logistics. He had seen a man lose a magazine pouch in a night river crossing, and another man cursed because he couldn't fit a teammate's spare. Standard issue was not only about supply, it was about being interchangeable under pressure. When he saw Ward with her own rifle, he saw a crack in that interchangeability. He did not confront her. He chose instead to steer the group back to focus, using the quiet weight of his role. He asked if anyone had missed cold soak checks. He asked if everyone had tested their optics in the hangar's cold box. He asked if they had swapped their gloves for the thinner pair in their pockets. Those questions were safe and professional, yet they carried a message. Standard procedure mattered, and personal preference should not override it. Ward answered the questions and kept her hands on her gear. She looked at her rifle as if it were a tool, not a statement. When Harper's eyes caught hers, she held them. The gaze was steady, not defiant. She did not explain herself because explanation would invite debate, and debate would waste time. She was not there to win a conversation. She was there to move and survive. The teasing rolled into small remarks about rookies and stubbornness. Ward was not a rookie, but she had transferred from a different unit the previous year, and that made her an outsider. A different unit meant different habits. The jokes were a test as much as relief. Unit culture under stress was a filter. If she pushed back, they would push harder. If she ignored it, the jokes would die. She ignored it, and the jokes died. Caldwell watched the dynamic and let it settle. He could have cut it off, but he knew that sometimes the light friction of a team was a way of checking shape before a mission. If it stayed small, it could be absorbed. If it grew, he would intervene. He watched Ward, and saw the discipline to stay in her lane. He watched the others, and saw no malice, only uncertainty. They had not yet seen why a refusal could be a kind of caution rather than pride. When they boarded the transport, the engine vibration erased most small talk. The cabin was cold enough to stiffen joints. The team sat in a line, rifles upright between knees. Ward's rifle looked older, the edges worn where her grip met the metal. It was not decorated, not personalized, not a statement. It was a piece of equipment she trusted. The flight took them over dark timber and frozen lakes. The world below was a grid of white and black. The storm had moved in from the west, and the pilot kept low, following terrain. Wind buffeted the hull. In the cabin, heads lowered, eyes closed. The humor from the hangar was gone. In its place was a quiet, focused readiness, the kind that made professional people dangerous when the time came. At the landing zone, cold struck like a wall. The air had the sharpness of dry metal. The team unloaded fast, dragging sleds and cases across a crust of snow that snapped like thin glass. The light was flat, the kind that erased distance. Caldwell ordered a short halt behind a low rise. He gave them 3 minutes to settle into the cold. Ward dropped to one knee and unzipped her case. She did not hurry. The cold demanded deliberate movements. She removed the rifle and set it across her pack, exposing the action. She checked the bolt carrier for the thin, dry lubricant she preferred in low temperatures. She ran her glove along the lugs, feeling for any stiffness. She flipped the optics cover and watched the lens for fog. She cycled the bolt once, slow and controlled. The action moved with resistance that was expected and predictable. She inspected her magazines, checking the spring tension by thumb. The springs held. She tapped the follower, felt it glide. She moved to the sight, confirming 0 marks with a cold fingertip. Her notes were etched in a small waterproof notebook, not from habit alone, but from the knowledge that cold made memory unreliable. She had taken this rifle through training in similar climates, and had learned how it behaved when the temperature dropped and the wind never stopped. Her system was not illegal, not forbidden. It was approved by mission parameters that allowed personal gear, so long as it met the required standards and was inspected. She had done the paperwork weeks ago, knowing that a deployment into this environment would punish anything untested. She had used a lower power optic that resisted fogging and did not rely on a battery as its only solution. She had replaced the standard lubricant with a product she had seen work under cold-soak conditions. She had kept her magazines in an inner pocket to maintain spring temper. These were not secrets. They were procedure. The issued rifles were new enough to be clean, but clean did not mean prepared. Standard lubricant had a temperature window. The optics had a battery that could falter in the cold. The rubberized grips could stiffen. None of these issues were catastrophic in mild weather. In this place, small margins turned into failures. She did not lecture the team because lectures did not survive the cold. She did not tell them the issued rifles had a known failure risk in sub-zero wind if the weapon had been stored warm and moved suddenly into freezing air. She assumed they knew or would learn quickly. She focused on what she could control: her weapon, her rhythm, the window of shots she would take when the time came. The team prepared in their own ways. Carter checked his sling and snapped his bolt once. Harper pressed his optics power button and watched the reticle appear. Pierce adjusted his gloves and tucked a spare battery inside his jacket. The armorer's warning about speed over customization echoed in the way their checks were short. They were not careless, but they were constrained by time, and the cold now made speed more urgent. Caldwell watched their motions and listened to the wind. He could hear it slipping over the ridge, a constant hiss, a noise that made radio communication harder than it had a right to be. The plan relied on speed, silence, and the ability to deliver precise fire for short windows. It did not rely on long firefights. If weapons failed, the plan would fracture. Ward reassembled her rifle, secured the optic cover, and slid the weapon into the sling. She stood and listened. Her breath came out in a steady plume, and she kept her pace even. There was no drama in her movements. There was no emphasis, no performance. She moved the way a professional moved, when the only audience was the environment itself. They moved along a frozen creek bed that wound between low ridges. The snow crust cracked under each step, a thin veneer over softer powder. The team stayed off the higher ridgeline to avoid exposure. The wind cut across the valley, peeling at their hoods and freezing the moisture at their collars. Caldwell kept the pace steady, a rhythm that warmed the muscles but didn't sweat them. Sweating in this temperature was a slow enemy. Comms degraded as they went deeper. Radio hiss filled their earpieces, and their words flattened by static. Caldwell and Harper switched to hand signals, then to simple touches on the shoulder when the wind became too loud. The extraction window was tight. A storm was predicted to turn the valley into a blind funnel within hours. Their mission, a quick strike on a relay site, depended on precision and timing more than weight of fire. They reached the first observation point sooner than planned. Caldwell motioned them down. He lifted binoculars to his eyes and scanned the slope across the creek. The relay site sat on a knuckle of rock with a small generator shed and a narrow antenna mast. Movement flickered near the structure. Two figures walked a short route around the fence line. Their timing was not what Caldwell had expected. The enemy was awake and moving, earlier than the intel predicted. He made a decision. He signaled to shift right, to use the frozen creek's meandering bend as a shield. The team crept, their sleds scraping softly over the crust. The radio hiss grew worse. When Caldwell tried to report the adjustment to higher command, his words were lost in static. He tried again and saw Harper's expression. The comms degraded enough to make him choose silence. They were now operating on their own. The wind surged, carrying a spray of powder across their faces. Frost formed on the edges of their optics. The world narrowed to a tunnel of cold air and white ground. The plan had already started to bend. A soft crack split the air. It was not gunfire, but the sound of a distant frozen tree branch snapping in the wind. Then came a sharper sound, a suppressed shot that slapped the snow near Pierce's boots. Caldwell dropped into a crouch and signaled contact. The enemy had seen movement early. They were no longer invisible. They accelerated to cover, using a low berm. Harper raised his rifle and looked through the optic, then pulled his head back. His lens fogged at the edges. He blinked, rubbed it with a gloved finger, and tried again. He pressed the power button. The reticle flickered. The battery was cold. The rifle was new, but the optic was not prepared for a wind that drained heat from metal faster than it could be replaced. Ward slid into a prone position and aligned her sight. Her optic, lower powered and sealed, remained clear. She saw a figure moving near the relay site and tracked. She held her fire, waiting for Caldwell's signal. He waved her off, holding to the plan despite the contact. The team shifted left. They were still in the approach phase, and the goal remained the relay site, not a firefight. Another suppressed shot snapped, and the team ducked. The enemy was probing. Carter raised his rifle and squeezed a shot. The bolt cycled slowly, then hesitated. A sluggish movement. The weapon fed the next round, but it was not smooth. A tiny delay in a fight that could not afford delay. Caldwell measured the distance, the cover, the wind. The plan required a quick burst of precise fire to breach the relay site's perimeter and disable the antenna. That window was shrinking as enemy attention sharpened. He made the call to accelerate, and the team began a low rush toward the next cover, their movements timed between gusts and shots. The first failure came at the worst moment, when they were exposed in the open, a stretch of hard-packed snow between the creek bend and the next berm. Harper led, then Pierce, then Ward, then Carter. Caldwell brought up the rear with Foster. The line moved in short, practiced bursts. A shot snapped from the ridge. Harper dropped and rolled, then fired a quick response. His rifle cycled with a sticky hesitation. He adjusted his grip and pushed the bolt forward. It went into battery, and he fired again. The second shot did not chamber. The bolt halted halfway, the cold, thickened lubricant slowing its return. He thumbed the forward assist and forced it closed. It was enough to keep him in the fight, but it was a warning. He had felt this before in training, and had hoped the new rifles would shrug it off. The wind proved him wrong. Carter reached the berm and raised his rifle to cover Pierce. He squeezed the trigger and got a click instead of a crack. He attempted a tap and rack, but his gloves were thick and his hands numb. The magazine was cold, the spring sluggish. The bolt would not strip the next round. The rifle was still, useless for the seconds that mattered. An enemy observer rose behind the fence line at the relay site, an optic glinting in the pale light. That observer saw Carter's movement and had a clear shot line. He was about to call in a directional volley that would pin the team in the open. Carter worked the bolt, then tried again. The rifle did not cycle. Ward saw the movement. She did not speak. She slid her rifle into position, calculated the wind, and fired a single shot. The suppressor muffled the sound, but the effect was immediate. The observer dropped out of view. The window closed before the enemy could adjust. Caldwell saw Carter's hands on his rifle, saw the failure, saw Ward's shot. He did not speak in that moment because words would have been redundant. He used a hand signal to keep the push forward. The team moved, now under cover from the berm. The immediate danger had been cut short by Ward's shot, not by the issued rifles that were supposed to do the work. The rifle failure had consequences beyond the missed shot. It had cost seconds, and seconds in the open could have cost a man. Carter felt it. He had seen the observer and had known what it meant. He glanced at Ward's rifle with a new assessment. He said nothing because words were not part of the plan, and because he knew that a comment would not change what had already happened. Harper shifted next to Caldwell and spoke quietly, just enough to be heard under the wind. He reported the sluggish cycling. Caldwell acknowledged with a nod. The plan had to adjust. They were now in an engagement with equipment that could not be trusted at the margin. The mission could still succeed, but they would need to ration their shots and avoid any reliance on a rapid rate of fire. Ward did not say anything about her refusal. She watched the ridge and prepared for the next movement. Her role was not to prove a point. It was to keep the team moving and alive. Caldwell reassigned the pace. Ward would anchor the team's movement, delivering the key shots that opened each window of movement. The others would hold fire unless a threat was immediate and certain. It was not a formal command, but the pattern settled within seconds because the team recognized the reality. The rifle that worked became the rifle that mattered. Ward took a position behind the berm and scanned the relay site. She tracked the enemy's pattern. A guard moving from the shed to the antenna base. A second guard circling the perimeter. A third figure near a crate by the fence. She waited for the right angle, the moment when a single shot would create a gap in the enemy's awareness. The wind shifted, and she adjusted her hold. She fired once, and the guard on the fence line crumpled behind the snowdrift. Caldwell moved the team in a low rush. Harper and Pierce crossed the open ground, using Ward's shot as cover. Carter followed with Foster, carrying a sled. The enemy fired a short burst, but it was blind, their line of sight disrupted by the fallen guard. The team reached the next cover without losing momentum. Ward's system was not built for volume, but it did not need to be. It was built for reliability and predictable behavior in cold, and that was the metric that counted now. She used it to create short, clean windows. Each shot was measured for effect, not for expression. The rhythm was disciplined. Observe, decide, fire, move. The team fell into it. Harper felt the shift. The man who had seen a refusal as a crack now saw it as a kind of risk management. It was not a statement of superiority. It was a choice made in advance for conditions exactly like these. He noted it without the need to say it. His job was to keep the team moving and functioning, and he adjusted his expectations accordingly. Caldwell moved with the line, his eyes on Ward and the relay site. He was aware that any reliance on a single weapon could be dangerous in its own way. But at this moment, the danger of unreliability was greater. He saw Ward's control and matched his plan to it. He also began to search for ways to mitigate the rest of the team's failure risk. Moving rifles under jackets between engagements, using body heat to keep batteries warm, stripping and relubing if time allowed. The enemy's response grew more organized. Shots came from 2 points now, not one. A machine gun on the far side of the relay site began to traverse, its sound a low, steady thump, muffled by the wind. The distance made the fire inaccurate, but it forced the team to keep low. Ward fired again, a longer shot this time, and the machine gun stuttered. The gunner dropped out of view. The gun did not go silent for long, but the pause was enough for Caldwell to shift the team to the final approach line. They were now within the last push, a short climb toward the fence line. Caldwell signaled the next move. Ward gave a nod. She took a breath, felt the cold in her lungs, and waited for a lull in the wind. She fired a precise shot at the antenna base, shattering the small conduit box that fed the system's power. The relay site went dark. That was one objective down. The team still needed to exfiltrate, and now the enemy's attention would sharpen further. Ward's rifle had become the hinge on which the entire mission rotated. The exfiltration route crossed open ground where snow lay deep and powdery. The team moved in single file along the lee side of a ridge, aiming for a ravine that would shield them from the relay site. The wind had strengthened, and the air carried tiny ice crystals that clung to optics and seams. The cold found every weakness in gear, and it was patient. Pierce's optic died first. He pressed the power button and saw nothing. The battery, already weak, had surrendered in the cold. He swapped it for the spare he had kept in his pocket. The reticle returned, then dimmed again. The battery warmed only when held against skin, but he could not keep it there. He continued with iron sights and a focus that narrowed his field of view. It was a compromise that cost him awareness. Harper felt his bolt grow stiff. He broke the rifle open, stripped the bolt, and wiped it with a cloth. The lubricant had begun to thicken. He applied a smaller amount of the dry lube he carried in a vial for this reason. He worked the action repeatedly until it cycled with less drag. He did this while crouched behind a snow berm with the wind cutting through his collar. It was a field expedient fix, not a solution. The weapon was still on a margin. Carter's magazine spring slowed further. The round count in his magazine had dropped, and the spring tension fell with it. The follower barely pushed the next round into position. He switched to a fresh magazine and put the old one inside his jacket. He would use body heat to revive the spring, but it would take time. Every adaptation was a trade. Warmth for speed, accuracy for reliability, precision for survival. The team encountered a shallow depression in the snow and dropped into it to regroup. The wind whistled across the top like a saw. Caldwell made a quick count, checked for injuries, and signaled a change in route. The enemy had moved on the relay site's flank, creating a possible intercept line. Caldwell chose a narrower ravine to avoid it, knowing that the narrow space could also become a trap, if they were seen. Ward watched the ridge lines, her optic clear. She could see the enemy's movement in the distance, a line of figures moving parallel to her team, their rifles at the ready. She could also hear the faint clack of her own bolt, a reassuring sound in the wind. The suppressed crack of her shots was softer than the wind's constant roar, but the results were visible. She picked a lead figure and fired. The figure dropped, the line staggered, and the enemy's pace slowed. This did not end the threat. It shifted it. The enemy began to maneuver, splitting into two elements. The team felt the pressure mount as they moved through the ravine. The snow in the ravine was deep, and each step sucked energy. The sleds dragged. The wind became a constant force that seemed to push them backward. A shot cracked close. Foster flinched and stumbled. The bullet had come in low, kicking up snow beside his boot. He crouched and returned fire. His rifle cycled slowly, then jammed. The bolt halted on a round that had not fully seated. He cleared it with a strip and slap, his hands clumsy in the cold. He got the rifle back, but he had lost seconds and rhythm. The enemy's shots were now closer. Caldwell called for a halt in a shallow cut and signaled Ward to cover. She moved to a small rise and took position. She fired a short sequence of shots, each one timed to create space. The team used the space to adjust gear, to warm batteries, to relube actions. It was a pause that cost them time, but it was a pause that saved their ability to fight. The snow made liars out of standard gear. Equipment that was reliable in temperate ranges became unreliable in this cold. It was not a failure of design so much as a failure of assumption. Standard issue assumed a median environment. This environment was not median. Ward kept the team alive by limiting shots to only what changed the situation. She did not fire to relieve fear or to signal presence. She fired to create movement, to cut off a flank, to silence a weapon that was about to speak. In between, she watched the wind and listened to its rhythm. The sound of the wind told her when a shot would be masked, when movement could be hidden, when a lull would expose them. She used those moments as if they were part of the terrain. A casualty drag became necessary when Foster slipped on ice and twisted his knee. It was not a full injury, but it slowed him. Harper and Carter grabbed his harness and pulled. The sleds now carried weight that had been intended for gear only. The team's pace dropped. Caldwell made another route adjustment, seeking deeper cover. Each change reduced the enemy's line of sight, but it also narrowed the path and increased the risk of a dead end. The choices were difficult and immediate, and they were made without debate. The enemy fired a flare. The light arced high, its glow turning the snow into a stark field. Shadows sharpened. The team froze, pressed into the ravine walls. The flare hissed as it burned, and the wind carried its smoke. Under that light, any movement would be seen. Ward stayed still, rifle aligned, ready for a target to appear on the ridge. When the flare burned out, the darkness returned, and the team moved again. The ravine opened into a narrow basin surrounded by low rock. It was the fastest route to the extraction point, but it was also a bowl. If the enemy reached the rim first, the team would be trapped. Caldwell weighed the risk and chose speed. He ordered them across in a sprint, using Ward's fire to keep the rim clear. They moved. The wind cut across the basin, carrying the sound of boots and sled runners. The enemy responded quickly. A machine gun rattled from the far rim, rounds cutting into the snow. The team dropped and crawled. The basin offered little cover. A few scattered rocks and a frozen hummock were all they had. Pierce raised his rifle and squeezed a shot. The bolt cycled, then stopped. He attempted to clear it, but his fingers were numb and the wind did not allow precision. He had to remove his glove, exposing skin to the cold. The metal burned against his fingertips. He cleared the jam and reloaded, but the delay was costly. The machine gun's fire did not let up. Ward fired at the gunner. Her first shot kicked snow close to the rim. Her second shot struck and the gun fell silent. The team used the pause to move again. Then another enemy took over the gun. The pattern repeated, each time tightening the margin. Ward's rifle performed without hesitation. But the enemy could rotate gunners faster than she could stop them if the team did not move. Caldwell made a hard call. The sleds were slowing them, and the extra gear was now a burden. He signaled to abandon non-essential equipment. He knew it would complicate the mission's after-action accounting, but it would save lives. Harper cut a strap, and a sled tipped, its cargo spilling into the snow. They left it. The lighter load allowed a faster push, but it was not enough. The enemy's fire continued. Carter's rifle failed again. The magazine did not feed. He attempted a reload and realized the spare mag was stiff, its spring sluggish. He slapped it in, worked the bolt, and got a single shot off. The rifle jammed again. He looked at Ward's position, at her steady movement, at how her rifle cycled clean. He understood then that the gear itself was the enemy, as much as the men on the rim. The enemy adapted, splitting into a flanking element that moved down the basin's right side. The flank moved fast and low, using the rocks for cover. Caldwell saw it and made a decision he did not want to make. He signaled to take the right side, toward the flank, rather than away from it. It was a choice between being trapped and meeting the threat on his terms. It meant exposing themselves to the flank before it could close. It meant trusting Ward's rifle and the team's discipline. Ward adjusted her position and waited for the flank to appear in her sight picture. She fired 3 controlled shots, each one timed when a target stepped out of cover. One fell, another dropped to a knee. The flank stalled. The team crossed the basin's center line and reached a low ridge on the far side. They were not safe, but they were no longer in the open. Foster stumbled again. His knee was worse. Harper and Carter hauled him over the ridge, their hands slipping on icy fabric. The wind cut through them, and their breath came in sharp bursts. Caldwell reached the ridge last and turned to scan. He saw the enemy's movement slow, the machine gun silent for the moment, the flare rack empty. He knew they had gained a narrow advantage, but only if they kept moving. Ward stayed on the ridge for 2 extra seconds, firing a final shot that hit the machine gun's tripod. The gun collapsed. She then slid down the far side, rejoining the team. Her decision to carry an older, reliable system had now passed its second test. The team did not need to discuss it to feel the shift in their respect. Their actions showed it. They positioned themselves in ways that leveraged her sightlines. They moved when she opened windows. They protected her position when the enemy pressed. The route to extraction narrowed into a tree line, the branches heavy with frost. The wind softened slightly, but the cold remained. The team moved between trunks, their footprints quickly filled by drifting snow. The enemy's pursuit became less direct, more cautious. They had lost momentum and had been forced to recover their own wounded. It bought the team distance. Caldwell called a short halt to reassess and warm batteries. He did it in a hollow where the trees blocked the wind. He checked on Foster and saw the strain in his face. He radioed for the extraction team and heard only static. He tried again and caught a broken response. They were close, but not yet on station. The storm had slowed them as well. Harper approached Ward and handed her a spare battery from his pocket. It was a simple gesture, not an apology. He said only that he had a warmed one if she needed it. She shook her head and kept her optic covered. The exchange was brief and quiet. It did not need a speech. Respect settled in the shape of small actions, not words. Carter adjusted his gloves and looked at his rifle with the frustration of a man who expected his tools to work. He had once teased her refusal. He no longer did. When he glanced at her, his expression was not guilt, but acknowledgement. He saw the preparation in her checks, the way she had traded convenience for reliability. He began to mimic her, tucking magazines inside his jacket and keeping his optic cover closed between movements. He learned by watching, not by being told. Caldwell updated their internal procedures in his head. If they survived, he would revise the cold weather prep checklist. He would include gear checks that allowed refusal of standard issue when conditions made it unsafe. He would argue for a larger window in the armory to allow customization and proper lubrication. These were future decisions, but they were born in this moment, in the evidence of their path through the snow. They moved again, the trees breaking the wind into softer sounds. The team did not talk. Their breath and the crunch of snow were the only noises. The silence was not empty. It was concentrated. Each man was focused on the next step, the next ridge, the next line of cover. Ward was near the front now. The order had shifted, and no one challenged it. She was the one with the rifle that had earned the lead. The extraction point came into view as a faint dark line in the storm, a line of low shrubs marking the edge of a frozen lake. They needed to cross the lake to reach the pickup zone on the far side, where the aircraft would land if the wind allowed. The lake was flat and exposed. The storm made distance hard to judge. Caldwell had to choose between crossing the open ice now or waiting in the trees and risking being overtaken. He chose to move. The team stepped out onto the ice, their boots slipping slightly. The wind was stronger here, unobstructed. It pushed at their backs and drove spindrift into their faces. The enemy fired a few distant shots that fell short. The line moved faster, a careful sprint. Ward kept her rifle ready, though she could see no targets. The open ice was a risk, but it was a path they had to take. When they reached the far side, the extraction team's signal light flickered through the storm. It was low and steady, almost lost in the wind. They found cover in a stand of scrub and waited. Caldwell finally made radio contact, a broken exchange that confirmed the aircraft's approach. They had done it. They had reached the edge of their plan without breaking. The aircraft appeared as a dark shape against the storm, its rotors carving the air. It settled into the clearing with a swirl of snow. The team rushed forward, their bodies low against the rotor wash. They loaded Foster first, then the sleds they had kept, then themselves. Ward climbed last, her rifle slung tight, her eyes still on the tree line. Inside the aircraft, the heat was minimal, but enough to thaw the edges of their gear. Caldwell counted heads and saw the fatigue on each face. He did not speak. The mission was complete, but the cost had been close. He made notes in his head, the kind that would become after-action lines later. At the staging base, they moved into the hangar and turned in what they could. The armorer looked at their rifles, at the ice on their receivers, at the mud on their slings. He said nothing. He did not need to. The weapons told the story. The standard issue rifles that had been signed out were returned with notes about cycling issues, fogged optics, and battery failures. The after-action report would record the issues as contributing failure factors in a hostile environment. Ward cleaned her rifle in silence, wiping down the metal and inspecting the bolt. Her hands moved with the same careful discipline they had in the armory. The rifle had performed because it had been prepared. That preparation had been a decision that some had mocked. The mission had shown what that decision meant. Caldwell wrote the report late that night. He noted that the standard issue rifles had suffered cold weather reliability problems. He noted that Ward's approved alternate system had remained functional and had provided critical fire capability when the standard weapons did not. He recorded her refusal of standard issue as a mitigating factor that preserved operational effectiveness. He did not phrase it as praise. He framed it as a fact of mission execution. The team did not celebrate. They slept, they warmed their hands, and they reviewed what could be improved. The teasing from the hangar was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet respect that did not need words. The next time they stood in line at the armory, their eyes lingered longer on the rifles. They asked different questions. They checked their own gear with new attention. Ward's decision had saved them. It had not been dramatic. It had been a calm refusal of a tool that would fail in the conditions they faced. It had been an act of risk management, of professional preparation, of discipline in the face of standard procedure that did not fit the environment. In the end, What mattered was not the refusal itself, but the evidence of it in the snow, and the sound of a bolt that kept moving when it needed to. The storm kept the base in a gray state for another day, the kind of weather that erased horizon and made even routine movements feel like patrols. The team remained in the hangar complex, recovering equipment and waiting for the next briefing. The lull was not restful. It was a quiet that asked for analysis. Caldwell convened a short review in a side room, with a table scarred by past deployments. He kept the session tight. He wanted observations, not complaints. Harper spoke first, noting the exact moment his bolt began to slow and what he had done to keep it moving. Pierce reported the optic failure, the battery flicker, and the decision to switch to irons. Carter described the magazine issues, the stiffness of the springs, and the failure to feed under cold. Foster spoke about the jam during contact and the loss of time while clearing it. Ward described her checks, her lubrication choice, and the optics she used. She did it with the same procedural tone she used in the field. She did not tell them they should have done the same. She described only what she had done and what she observed. The others listened. The room was still enough that the hum of the heater could be heard behind the wall. Caldwell asked how much time the failures had cost. The answers were measured in seconds, but the weight of those seconds was understood. The after-action report would not dramatize it. It would record that weapon performance in extreme cold was degraded and that mission success had relied on a single weapon system that remained reliable. That was enough to justify a change in preparation procedure. Later, Caldwell and Harper spoke in the corridor. Harper acknowledged that he had read Ward's refusal as personal stubbornness. He now saw it as technical prudence. He did not apologize. He did not need to. He said he would support updated procedures. Caldwell agreed. The shift was simple. Give the armorer more time to allow cold soak checks, allow approved alternate systems without stigma, and ensure standard rifles were prepped with cold-rated lubricant and optics with warmed batteries. These changes were not a revolution. They were adjustments that respected reality. In a different environment, the standard rifles would have been sufficient. In this one, the difference between sufficient and reliable was the margin between getting out and staying in the snow. The next mission was delayed by the storm. When it did arrive, the team returned to the armory with a different demeanor. The line was the same, but the questions were not. Men asked about lubrication, about cold soak time, about optic battery tolerances. The armorer, now briefed by Caldwell and Harper, had a small table set aside with cold-rated oil and a rack for weapons to cool before issue. He did not say much. He did not have to. His actions were the policy. Ward arrived early, her rifle already checked. She placed the paperwork on the counter before anyone asked. The armorer inspected the rifle, checked the serial, and handed it back without hesitation. The moment was not dramatic. It was the normalization of a practice that had been a point of friction before. The team saw it and adjusted. Their world had shifted by a degree, and in this environment, degrees mattered. The second mission did not unfold with the same urgency, but the environment remained unforgiving. The team moved with more preparation and fewer assumptions. Their rifles were cold-soaked. Their batteries were warm. Their magazines were kept inside their jackets between movements. Ward's role remained important, but it was now integrated into a larger system of care. The team had learned, and that learning was not a speech. It was a pattern of actions. Caldwell wrote a short memo to the battalion logistics officer. He outlined the issues, attached data on temperature and weapon performance, and recommended updates to standard procedure for cold weather deployments. He expected it to take time, but he knew the record had to be made. Sometimes the only change that mattered was the one written into a document that would be read by someone else on a different day, before a different mission. Ward returned to her bunk after the memo went out. She cleaned her rifle by the small light over her cot. The metal warmed under her hands. She thought about the moment in the armory when she had slid the clipboard back across the counter. She had not done it for attention. She had done it because she knew what a cold rifle could do when it was unprepared, and because she had seen it in training, in the bodies of men who had learned too late. Her decision had been simple. The consequences had been complex. She did not seek acknowledgement, and it did not come in a way that would have satisfied anyone else. Instead, it came in the way Harper watched her hands on the next mission, in the way Carter asked about magazine springs, in the way Caldwell altered a checklist. It came in the quiet way the team moved when she fired, trusting the window she created. This was how respect looked in a place where speech was expensive. The story of the mission would not be told with dramatic flourishes. It would be recorded in an after-action report, a line in a training update, a small change in an armory procedure. It would live in the habits of a team that had learned a lesson about standard issue and the environment. That lesson was not that standard gear was bad, but that standard assumptions could be dangerous when conditions were not standard. On the last day before rotation, the storm eased. The sky cleared enough to show a band of pale blue over the ridges. The base looked smaller in the light, a temporary set of structures that would disappear with the season. Ward stood outside the hangar and watched the wind in the trees. The cold still bit, but it was no longer the enemy it had been on the mission. She felt the metal of her rifle through her gloves, and knew it would do what she needed it to do. She thought of the team in the basin, the moment of the machine gun, the flare light. She remembered the sound of her bolt cycling, the way that sound had remained steady when everything else seemed to falter. She did not feel pride. She felt a quiet affirmation that preparation mattered. That was enough. The team boarded the transport for the rotation home. The cabin was noisy, filled with the rustle of gear and the low murmur of tired men. Carter sat across from Ward and nodded once. It was a small gesture. It was sufficient. Harper closed his eyes and leaned his head against the bulkhead. Caldwell looked out the small window and watched the base recede. The mission had been completed. The lessons would follow them. If the story were ever told, it would not be told as a legend. It would be told as a lesson in preparation, in the way that small decisions made far ahead of a crisis could change the outcome. It would be told in the language of logistics and procedure, not in the language of heroism. That suited Ward. She had not wanted to be a symbol. She had wanted to keep her team alive. The decision that saved them was not a dramatic act in the field. It was a quiet refusal at a counter in a cold armory, and the discipline to stand by it without needing anyone to understand until the snow made the point for her. The narrative of that day stayed with them. It was not the story of a single person's insight. It was a story about how the environment punishes assumption. It was about the importance of respecting tools, of knowing their limits, and of refusing to accept a standard that does not match the reality in front of you. Those who had once smirked learned to check their gear, to ask questions, to make room for careful dissent. It did not make them less cohesive. It made them more resilient. The base would mark the season in its logs, the missions in its reports. The armory would adjust its issue procedure. The people would carry the lessons into their next deployment. The snow would melt and return. The wind would change and return. The cold would always be there, indifferent to standard issue and procedure. The only response that mattered was preparation, the kind that began in a quiet moment when someone chose not to sign a clipboard. The story ends where it began, in the smell of cold oil and metal. The armory's door opens to the wind. The line forms. A rifle waits on the counter. A decision is made, simple and quiet. The difference is that this time, the decision is understood. The team has seen what standard costs in extreme conditions, and they have learned that survival sometimes begins with the courage to refuse what is offered.